All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Paradigm Sherpas. Today we're talking about David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard. It's about Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the rise of America's secret government. So, who is Alan Dulles? Well, he starts his career as a lawyer for the prominent law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, but he goes on to become an OSS spy appointed to Switzerland by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the OSS being the precursor organization to the CIA. After World War II, he has a stint as the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is one of those powerful, shadowy think tanks where politicians, military officials, and economic elites go and basically decide foreign policy and then go back to their respective countries and sort of dictate that foreign policy. So if you think of Council for Relations, you can think of like the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberger Group, the Trilateral Commission, all the same kind of vibe. And then eventually Dulles does go on post World War II to become the deputy director of the CIA, and then the longest serving director of the CIA, starting under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, we'll get into all that, but let's stick to the beginning of the story. So, he's a lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell. He works there with his brother, John Foster Dulles. Foster Dulles does go on to become the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And these two guys in the World War I era worked together to represent their firm and their clients, who are big Wall Street organizations that are seeking to benefit from the revitalization and reindustrialization of Germany post World War One. Basically, World War One happens, the Allied powers defeat Germany and say, "Hey, this is all your fault. You have to pay us a bunch of money to make up for starting this whole war." So the Dulles brothers and their firm Sullivan and Cromwell represent Wall Street, start injecting capital back into Germany, building it up so that they can, cash on the dividends from these investments into post World War One Germany. Well, post World War One Germany eventually becomes Nazi Germany, and even though the United States didn't look upon Nazi Germany favorably even before World War II, the Dulles brothers worked with them very closely. Now, um, the US government took a lot of steps to sort of stop investment into Nazi Germany. And one example would be J. Edgar Hoover overtaking Prescott Bush's bank under the Trading with the Enemies Act. So the Dulles brothers are basically not taking their foot off the gas as it relates to investing in Germany, even when it falls under Nazi power. And this goes so far as Alan Dulles even sitting on the board of a bank that was basically thought of as the economic booster for the Axis powers, at least according to Time magazine. Now, the Dulles brothers are funding post World War One Germany and funding the Nazis. And at the same time, a lot of their clients in the United States are planning a coup against FDR. And they go knocking on the door of the most decorated war veteran in U.S. history, two-time Medal of Honor recipient, Marine General Smedley Butler. And Smedley Butler actually plays along with the ruse for a while, just long enough to gather enough information on the coup plotters, which included the DuPont family, who the Dulles brothers represented. And Butler takes this information to Congress and testifies under oath that these people are trying to lead a coup, fascist coup, and put him in charge of the military to lead a march on Washington and kick out FDR. And Congress listens. They say, yeah, maybe there's some truth to that, but they don't take any action because, surprise, surprise, they're in the pockets of the people who wanted to enact the coup in the first place. Now, this, shadowy group of financial elite don't stop with their failed coup with Smedley Butler. They merely double down their efforts to empower Nazi Germany. Dulles gets sent to Switzerland at the beginning of World War II to be an OSS spy. the very first thing he does is go meet with this guy, Thomas McKittrick, and says, "Hey, old pal, don't worry. We'll make sure that the Bank of International Settlements can keep laundering Nazi money, including, stolen gold from Holocaust victims, to their friends in Wall Street across the pond." Roosevelt administration was going to freeze Bank of International Settlement funds. Foster Dulles ensured that they stayed open for business. Now, Dulles was supposed to be in Switzerland working on behalf of the U.S. government. He was more interested in enabling the existing network of people that he represented. Um, he was brought information about the Holocaust very early on in his time in Germany, and he basically overlooked it. He had the power to take action. He was informed that hundreds of Jewish people were being murdered via gas chambers. He pretended to be shocked. He pretended he was going to pass the information along, but he did nothing about it. And he probably doomed a group of Jewish refugees who were on a boat off the coast of the United States because he didn't pass this information up the chain to tell um, you know, Roosevelt and the higher ups what was going on. And that may have led to the United States letting this group of refugees into the country. Instead, they turned them away and sent them back to Nazi occupied Europe. Now, after World War II, Dulles decided to stick around, and John Loftus suggests that Dulles only stuck around because he wanted to help destroy files that would incriminate him for continuing to work with the Nazis, even while he was supposed to be a U.S. government intelligence officer working against the Nazis. Now, post World War II, Roosevelt had a plan to bring, collaborators and Nazis alike to justice. Uh, Wild Bill Donovan, who was the head of the OSS, the US's intelligence group, tried to curtail that. He wanted to bring some of these people under his wing to help, exploit them and use them in the upcoming fight against the Russians. Well, a lot of people were pissed off at Donovan because he tried to cut some deals with some of the worst of Nazi war crime perpetrators like Hermann Goering. But and he wasn't successful, right? People were like, "Get lost, Donovan." Well, Dulles was actually pretty successful. Dulles enacted something called Operation Sunrise, where he cut deals with a number of prominent Nazis, psychopathic murderers like Karl Wolff. He got some cover from the media. His good pal Henry Luce, who was the owner of Time magazine, called uh, Dulles's actions a stunning triumph, even though they were completely contrary to the direction given to him by the commander in chief of the United States. Now, Karl Wolff was a particularly shitty person. I mean, he was overseeing um, showcases of slave labor camps to corporate donors, saying, "Hey, check out all the productivity from these slaves we've got for you guys." And he tortured OSS agents, colleagues of Allen Dulles' to death. And really, some of the most gruesome things Wolf was involved with were these medical experiments, like freezing prisoners or taking these prisoners to the brink of being frozen solid, then thawing them and then freezing them again and repeating the process to test the effects of cold weather. And he also did this with people as it relates to um, testing what would happen to them in low oxygen scenarios. He'd put them in these low oxygen chambers, basically pull all the air out and see what would happen to them. They'd start suffocating, and as they're about to die, they would pump oxygen back in and repeat the process until these people eventually died. So pretty shitty stuff, but Karl Wolff is protected by Dulles because Dulles wants to use him for his fight against the Soviets. Now, another guy that Dulles helps get out of the hangman's noose is Walter Ruff. He designed these mobile gas chambers that ended up killing 250,000 people. Absolutely disgusting. And then, Dulles wasn't alone, right? He had a whole crew of people helping him sneak people out of, former Nazi Germany via these rat lines to go to places like South America, in particular Argentina. Okay, so that's really the first segment of the book. We talk about Dulles' early journey that eventually leads him to become the deputy and then director of the CIA, and then serve as the longest tenured CIA director until he eventually gets the can from Kennedy. So, post World War II, Dulles has helped sneak out a bunch of Nazis via the rat lines. He also helps this guy, Frank Wisner, one of his colleagues, set up the Office of Policy Coordination under the CIA. So, the CIA is started by Truman. Wisner builds this office of 3,000 plus spies and assassins all over Europe with hopes of thwarting the expansion of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union. And at the time, Dulles isn't actually part of the CIA quite yet, or maybe he is, but he's deputy director. He had this stint post World War II where he was the president of the Council of Foreign Relations. So he did that. Then he becomes deputy director of the CIA under Truman. At some point around there, though, he's helping Wisner facilitate the growth of this spy, sabotage, and assassination network. So he helps Wisner build this network. But back home, a young Richard Nixon, Navy officer, actually finds evidence of Dulles having laundered money for the Nazis. So Dulles catches wind of this, and to help secure Nixon's allegiance and to help keep his mouth shut, Dulles says, "Yo, man, how about I get you some money to help you beat this guy Jerry Voorhees in your first congressional campaign?" Nixon says, "All right, that sounds like a fair deal." And Dulles secures $1,000 from a former Romanian Nazi collaborator, Nicolae Malaxa, and actually funds Nixon's campaign like he says he does. So very early on in Nixon's career, he becomes connected with the CIA spook master, Alan Dulles. And that we'll probably talk about a little bit later, but it's important to know that these two were very much connected at the hip from the beginning of Nixon's step into the congressional and eventually presidential world. Now, Talbot points out this secret network is really starting to build, right? Like you've got Dulles now in a key government position as the deputy director of the CIA. He's very intimately intertwined with Law Street firms as well as Wall Street corporations. And these groups sort of form this trifecta or this triangle of power that begins to operate as a deep state. Now, this concept is not new, right? The intersection of finance and government forming coalitions that have ulterior motives and subvert uh, government authority or the mandate of the people. It's probably been going on forever, but you can see this quote by FDR that says, "A financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson." So at least in the American experience, FDR suggests this has been going on forever. But the modern incarnation of it um, forms, well, there's an incarnation of it that forms under Dulles, with Dulles being a key operator in this, newfound secret government. So Dwight D. Eisenhower takes the presidency, and he does it with the help of the Dulles brothers and a lot of their Wall Street friends. And he makes Foster Dulles the Secretary of State. He makes Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA, and Alan Dulles, as director of the CIA, has some initial enemies or a couple people that are challenges to his power. The first is Senator Joseph McCarthy. Now, McCarthy is a powerful, or at least growing in popularity, senator from Wisconsin who leads this witch hunt against communism within the United States. Somehow he's given the power to publicly interrogate pretty much anybody he wants and chastise them over potential communist leanings. Um, you'd think that this wasn't a big deal for Dulles, who's building up this massive network to thwart communism. But the reality was that McCarthy also targeted the CIA, and that was a big no-no for Dulles. He's just getting, his power shored up within that role, and he's not going to accept any challenge to his station or his newfound organization. So Dulles neutralizes McCarthy. He basically uncovers evidence that McCarthy actually might be gay. Kind of ironic because besides the communist witch hunt, McCarthy also was targeting people for being potential closeted homosexuals. Gets even weirder because his partner in crime for the communist witch hunt is Roy Cohn, who was the lawyer of the mafia, but also a closeted gay guy himself, and not it wasn't a very well kept secret. Like he had a pretty flamboyant boyfriend that he fought tooth and nail to prevent from getting drafted into the army. But nonetheless, Dulles diffuses McCarthy with these accusations of McCarthy being gay. McCarthy eventually spirals out into alcoholism and dies. But Dulles also has another challenge to his power in J. Edgar Hoover. Now, interestingly enough, J. Edgar Hoover was a closeted gay guy, and James Angleton and Dulles had pictures of Hoover giving a blowjob to his aide and longtime partner Clyde Tolson, and that was apparently enough to keep Hoover quiet and to stop him from causing a stink. Because originally Hoover wanted, the CIA to fall under his mandate. He was the longtime serving FBI director and thought that that power should come to him, but instead it eventually goes to Dulles. Now, when Dulles gets into power as the CIA director, he immediately goes on this like spree of coups. He starts a coup factory. Anybody that's a threat to his power or the power of his friends in Wall Street, he's taking out. Classic example, we'll go through a couple here. Iran, 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh is democratically elected under a platform planning to nationalize Iran's oil interests. Well, God forbid you're going to nationalize Iran's oil interests at the behest of Alan Dulles' Wall Street pals. Actually, Alan Dulles, before stepping into this office, helped try and facilitate what would have been the biggest oil deal in the world's history, or at least, modern history, with the Seven Sisters oil giants building all this infrastructure and getting drilling rights within Iran. Now, Mossadegh gets elected. That deal is nullified. They're all pissed. And Dulles says, all right, we're going to get rid of Mossadegh and we're going to put this asshole dictator, the Shah, in his place. Now, Eisenhower actually was initially against this. He was like, nah, we should give this Shah or this Mossadegh guy a chance and throw some money his way, help him get underway, help him get his feet under him, and he could become an ally. But Dulles convinced Eisenhower that if they let Mossadegh get in, he would become a communist sympathizer, and this would help spread the influence of the Soviet Union. So Eisenhower said, "Okay, I'm going to play golf. You take care of this guy, and don't tell me all the details about it." So we put in the Shah, puppet leader. He imprisons and tortures thousands of people. He's in office for decades until the Islamic Revolution in the 70s, which is now the authority still in power today, as the United States is bombing the crap out of Iran again. Makes you question, why we're doing it. people suggest that we're doing it for democracy. Well, let's go back to 53. They had a democracy, and we did everything we could to get rid of that democracy and put a dictatorship in place. So, just something to think about, the circular nature of history. It's repeating itself. Now, talk about maybe another coup or two from the book. This one's pretty awful. A popular election for Jacobo Arbenz. People wanted him to come in. He was kind of like a JFK figure for Guatemala. He was going to nationalize a lot of their resources, like plantations, railroads, uh, ports, the telephone lines, etc., and try and bring some of the benefits back to the people instead of the United Fruit Company, which was basically running Guatemala like it was its own uh, slave entity. Now, this threatened Dulas's business partners at United Fruit Company. So Dulles put E. Howard Hunt, one of his CIA minions, to the task of overthrowing Arbenz, putting in the Castillo regime, who killed 250,000 people over the ensuing decades. And they didn't just depose Arbenz, they publicly humiliated him. They when they pulled him out of the country, they brought him out on the runway at the airport with a bunch of cameras on him and made him strip naked to search him to make sure he wasn't bringing any stolen money with him, as they, got him out of the country to go live a life in exile. Now, there's one more coup that's particularly disgusting. This was the hardest part of the book for me to read. Patrice Lumumba rose in popularity in the Congo after they were oppressed by the Belgian crown for decades. The Belgians ruled the Congo with an iron fist. They were absolutely disgusting in their treatment towards the Congolese. King Leopold had a policy of chopping off the hand of any Congolese worker who didn't meet their quota and extracting resources from the ground. So Lumumba, wins a democratic election. He's the hope, the new hope for the country to take control of its own destiny. This upsets the Western mining powers, including those that are, intimately tied to Dulles. So we lead a coup under Dulles' CIA to go kill Lumumba. I believe it was Richard Bissell who was in charge of that coup. And the long story short is Lumumba is captured. He escapes because his people help him break out. He runs across the country um, while being chased by the people who led the coup, this General Mobutu, and he almost makes it to his stronghold. In fact, he does make it to his stronghold where he would basically be safe and be able to shore up power and, reestablish the democracy that he was elected to run. But what happens is he's the first person to cross the river to safety. And then when he crosses the river, he looks back, and the Mobutu forces and the CIA and the Belgian um, mercenaries are standing there, and they have his family. So he gets back on a boat, crosses the river, and is escorted away to a secret prison where, according to Talbot, he is beaten to death for hours in an orgy of sadism. And despite being brutally beaten to death for hours, it said that Lumumba never caved. He never begged for his life. He stayed resolute in, his convictions and wasn't going to be broken by these treacherous people. So it's a really horrible story through and through, but especially, how he was treated at the end of his life. Now, besides starting a factory of coups, Dulles started a lot of shady alliances, and I don't think there's one that's shadier, or it's at least up there. This is super shady. Reinhard Gehlen, this guy was in charge of the Nazi spy network against the Russians in World War II, and he murdered thousands of people, including OSS colleagues of Dulles, but nonetheless, Dulles brings him in to basically be the leader of the European spy network for the CIA with, some American oversight. But Galen, he tortured people to death. He killed American soldiers. He killed Jewish people, and he was an unrepentant Nazi. He actually had a plan to reformulate the Third Reich. He maintained this network of thousands of spies that Dulles was like, "Hey, I'm using this for my interests against the Soviets." But the whole time, Reinhard Gehlen was like, "All right, I'm just biding my time, building up the strength of these thousands of also unrepentant Nazis, and until we can reestablish ourselves and, finish what Hitler started." So really shitty guy, but Dulles was like, "No, I'm going to overlook that because we don't have an army of spies. It would take us years to build up an army of spies against the Soviet Union. They were our ally in World War II, so we don't have anybody in there." But so they used Galen, and they brought him to the United States to watch baseball games. They celebrated him, gave him a medal as an American hero, and the whole time he was a Nazi through and through that wanted to take over the government again and reinstall the Third Reich. Another, dangerous alliance that Dulles supported was connecting U.S. intelligence with the mafia. Now, in World War II, the United States buddied up with the mafia to try and get troops into Italy, but that connection with the mafia really flourished under Dulles. There's an example in the book where he used the mafia to kill basically a dissident teacher from Colombia who was critical of the CIA and their dictatorships they were supporting in South America. He used the mob to kill this guy, or actually extract this guy to have him killed in South America. But that relationship with the mafia really gets deep when we start talking about Cuba and the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the mafia is a very much a reoccurring theme and highly connected to the JFK assassination as well. Now, besides these treacherous partnerships that Dulles started, he also created this mind control program, and it spiraled out of control for decades under this guy, Sidney Gottlieb. Actually, I have a video where I've interviewed Stephen Kinzer, the author of a book called Poisoner in Chief, who basically documents Sidney Gottlieb's life and his work running these 140 plus mind control programs um, throughout the United States and abroad that involved giving people LSD 75 days in a row, trying to break down their minds and turn them into zombies, or like basically brainwash them to do whatever Gottlieb wanted. There's so many terrible stories that involved experimenting on individuals as well as groups of people, and then murdering them once they were done experimenting on them. And there's also a pretty famous case of the CIA murdering one of their own. This guy, Frank Olson, who was a chemical weapons specialist, who basically was like, "I can't be a part of this anymore." And to keep Frank quiet, they threw him out of a building um, and covered it up until the government actually basically came clean, I believe under the Ford administration. But definitely check out Kinzer's book, Poisoner in Chief. If you want to learn about government attempts to control our minds. Newsflash, MK Ultra may have stopped, but the CIA efforts to enact mind control are very much real and alive, and probably likely have pivoted to more of a technological effort as opposed to, under Dulles and Gottlieb, where it was more chemical focused. Okay, so Dulles created a coup factory, created all these nasty alliances with evil people. He's built out his spy and assassination network, and he is basically doing whatever he wants. And there's another great example of him doing whatever he wants, where he basically backstabs the guy who put him in the position of power, Eisenhower. Eisenhower is starting to try and come to some sort of peaceful terms with the Soviet Union, and Dulles doesn't like that at all. Um, and Eisenhower doesn't want to do these U-2 spy flights over the Soviet Union anymore. He thinks it's too risky to the peace process. He's about to go, meet for peace talks in Paris, and Dulles insists that, hey, this don't worry, it's okay. We're not gonna get caught. And so there's a suggestion in the book that to help tank these peace talks, uh, Dulles purposefully leaks information to the Russians that gets a U-2 spy plane shot down, so to sort of inflame, tensions. People actually suggest that the person who leaked that information might have been Lee Harvey Oswald, as we'll talk about soon. Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marine that worked at the U-2 spy plane base in Japan, and then he was a fake defector to the Soviet Union, but people think he was actually, really a spy of some sorts, pretending to defect to the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Eisenhower administration is coming to an end, and JFK is about to step in, and he is clearly going to be Dulles's biggest challenge or adversary to date. Now, when JFK is stepping into office, he has plans to eventually get rid of Dulles, but he doesn't want to upset the old guard too much, so he keeps a lot of these Eisenhower insiders in key positions, at least for the time being. But Dulles knows that Kennedy thinks highly of Richard Bissell and plans to make him the director of the CIA, and Dulles is not going to allow that to happen. So Dulles presents this plan, this can't fail plan, to Kennedy. Well, actually, he defers to Richard Bissell because Bissell wants the job and he's eager to prove himself to Kennedy. But they come up with this plan to overthrow Castro covertly. And Kennedy was for it at the time. He didn't want all out war with Cuba because he didn't want to inflame the tensions with the Soviet Union, but he wanted to get rid of Castro. So they come up with this plan, but Dulles knows this plan is going to fail. Bissell probably doesn't know this plan is going to fail. He thinks this is his path to promotion, moving higher up. But Dulles knows, hey, this is going to fail, and it's going to force Kennedy to send in the military and start a full-blown overt war with Cuba, and that's what Dulles wants. So the Bay of Pigs is launched. It doesn't work out. No surprise to Dulles. But what was a surprise to Dulles was that Kennedy said, fuck off. I am not sending in the American military to finish the job. I'm abandoning those 1,400 people. This was your guys' shitty plan. You knew it was going to fail from along, and I'm pissed that you trapped me. And he was so mad. He said the famous quote, I want to scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And from this point on, he's like, I'm out for blood. I'm firing Bissell. I'm getting rid of Dulles. And while he didn't shit on them publicly, like, he blamed this entirely on them. So Kennedy gets rid of Dulles. He fires him. He sends him off pretending he's some great guy. Kennedy takes all the heat in the press for the Bay of Pigs, but behind the scenes, make no mistake, he blames it all on Dulles. So he's made a huge enemy out of basically the most influential guy in the CIA. Um, he's also made an enemy of the higher ups on the Joint Chiefs. These guys, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, wanted Kennedy to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union and start a nuclear holocaust, killing everybody, and ruining the planet. And he didn't do that, so they were pissed at him. That's another group of powerful enemies. Kennedy also very early on in his presidency took on economic elites. One great example from the book is when he stuck it to U.S. steel magnates. Basically, the steel companies were charging unfair prices, and they were also not paying their workers fair wages. So Kennedy threatened to unleash his brother Bobby Kennedy and the Attorney General's office on them to launch really invasive and aggressive um, price fixing investigation. So the steel companies backed down and they said, okay, we'll play ball with you, Kennedy, but created a lot of enemies from that as well. Um, so you've got all these, really powerful enemies starting to surround Kennedy, and a lot of people also point out that um, Kennedy pumped the brakes on Israel's secret nuclear aspirations as well. So that was, another enemy. The list goes on, but the point being, Kennedy's got a bunch of powerful enemies now, and Dulles didn't just fade away into the distance. He kept running around town, specifically pulling people to his office at Q Street in, I believe, the Georgetown area. And he just kept going like he was CIA director, meeting with Angleton and Hunt, talking to his anti-Castro Cuban militants, um, brushing shoulders with everybody, including like his buddy who was the head of the U.S. Treasury, which are in charge of the Secret Service. He actually meets with the head of the Secret Service a month before Kennedy's assassinated, and that's really interesting because if you look at videos of the Kennedy assassination, you'll see just before Kennedy heads into Dealey Plaza, the Secret Service agents who are on the back of his vehicle protecting him from being shot, at least from some angles, are called off of his vehicle. And they turn around, they're looking like, what the fuck? Why would I be called off from standing on the back of the president's vehicle, exposing him to danger? And then, sure enough, he's killed like a couple seconds or minutes later. So what I'm getting to is Kennedy has all these enemies. Dulles is his number one enemy, and Dulles really starts plotting Kennedy's downfall. Now, was Dulles the key man behind planning the Kennedy assassination? Probably not. He was probably just well positioned to facilitate aspects of it, being that he was connected to all these key players in the mafia, the CIA. But Kennedy had a lot of powerful people that hated him, that Dulles, basically answered to, including like the Rockefellers. But very hard to pinpoint who actually was the one who paid for the bullet. And that's the famous quote from this book that was on the cover slide of the presentation. It's not when it comes to assassination, it's not about who pulled the trigger, but who paid for the bullet. Well, we don't know who paid for the bullet, but we are at least able to see people who are likely involved in pulling the trigger. And one of those people was a Dulles affiliate, um, Bill Harvey. Bill Harvey was the enemy of Bobby Kennedy. He hated JFK um, for a number of reasons, but especially for, the betrayal at the Bay of Pigs and firing Dulles. And Harvey worked intimately with Johnny Rosselli, who was like a mob lawyer um, connected to the Jewish mafia and Meyer Lansky. But Bill Harvey never let go of, how Kennedy betrayed the CIA, or rather the CIA's Cuban force going in to overthrow um, Castro, and he was in Dallas. Even though he was the station chief of the CIA in Rome, he was mysteriously in Dallas on the day Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. So Bill Harvey was a prime suspect, and how do we know that? Well, E. Howard Hunt, one of Dulles's lifetime accomplices in the CIA, was recorded as he was dying in 2007. His son set up a series of recordings asking him about his life in the CIA and more specifically the Kennedy assassination. And E. Howard Hunt was a little bit hesitant to throw his his pals under the bus, but he did go so far as to mention being approached by Bill Harvey, um, David Morales, and Frank Sturgis. And he suggested that Bill Harvey was, they had a plan. They approached him about a plan, the big event to kill Kennedy. And Bill Harvey was in charge of getting the sharpshooters in place and securing the weapons. David Morales, who was a CIA hitman, was in charge of operations. And Frank Sturgis, I can't really remember off the top of my head. You'll just have to read the book. I forget what Hunt said about Frank Sturgis's involvement. But the short of it is deathbed confessions. His son asks him, Dad, what's up? And he's like, Well, I was kind of involved, but I wasn't like the main person to make it happen. David Morales really hated Kennedy, so it's no surprise that he was involved. He was also disgruntled about the Bay of Pigs. He was a hitman that helped train a lot of the people who were left in Cuba to be arrested or killed by the Castro regime. Never forgave Kennedy, and he was overheard in a bar by a French journalist talking about the Kennedy assassination and was quoted as saying, "We took care of that son of a bitch, didn't we?" Suggesting that he didn't really care. He didn't do a good job of pretending like he wasn't involved. Now, let's wrap this up with a little bit of talk on Lee Harvey Oswald. We'd be crazy to talk about the Kennedy assassination if we didn't talk about him. So, Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marine who went on to be stationed in Japan at the U-2 spy base. After serving in the Marines, he went on to become a defector to the Soviet Union, where he showed up at the Soviet embassy, and people said it was almost like a planned performance where he's like, "I'm ready to give away U.S. secrets and defect and love Russia." Almost like he was trying too hard. Like, bro, we don't even believe you. This is like bad acting. But nonetheless, he lives in the Soviet Union for a couple of years. They take him. They're kind of like, who is this guy? He becomes friends with this dude, Ernst Titovitz. Titovitz goes on to write a book about his relationship with Oswald. And he's like, Oswald was not a murderer, first of all. Second of all, he was very intelligent. He wasn't some dumb, bozo who had no brain. Third, he was definitely a patsy in my mind. Like, there's no way he would do this. And I know this because I get into fights with him all the time where he talks about how great the United States is. He loves the United States and supports what the United States is doing throughout the world. So he's not really like some authentic defector who wants to be a communist. He had some ulterior motive. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald's mom comes out and says, Hey, Lee Harvey Oswald, my son, was some sort of secret spy. After he died, she came out and said that. And there's evidence to suggest he was. When he was in prison after the assassination, he used his one phone call to call back to uh, DC, and it's believed that he was calling his intelligence handler at the time, and that's something that people think really did him in for assassination because that exposed his connection to intelligence definitively. So after he did that, people were like, "Well, we have to kill him because uh, well, I honestly, I think they were going to kill him anyway. They couldn't let that go to trial and find out that he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Um, Last thing to say about him is that um, Dulles's guy, James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence, was the one who kept a file on Oswald, and that file was never revealed to the public. It was um, viewed by the CIA upon Angleton's death, but it was burned and destroyed, so nobody can ever see what the best information the CIA had on Lee Harvey Oswald. But Oswald said he was a patsy. He wasn't the killer. Um, the story just doesn't make sense, right? He defects to Russia. He somehow is allowed to come back to the United States. Now, at the height of the Cold War, where McCarthy's running these witch trials about communists, everybody, the press is talking about how evil the Soviet Union is. There's no way that a former Marine turned defector would be allowed back into the United States in that climate, let alone be allowed back in the United States, and the government gives him a loan to go get a house. He was basically welcomed with open arms. And when he gets back, not only does the government pay for him to get a house, he is surrounded by these two CIA babysitters, a guy George de Mohrenschildt. So de Mohrenschildt was basically super wealthy, helped Oswald get on his feet, um, took him under his wing, and Oswald really looked up to de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt actually, insisted later when the Congress was investigating this in the 70s, I believe their assassination committee was investigating, not the Warren Commission, but a separate investigation. He said, I don't think it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was found dead with his head blown off by a shotgun. Um, Someone was covering up loose ends. De Mohrenschildt was on the record saying, I can't say whether I ever was a CIA agent, but all implications were that he was at a minimum a CIA asset, also likely an agent. And then there's Ruth Paine, whose best friend was the mistress of Alan Dulles, this woman Anne Bancroft, who Dulles had an affair with for years. She's best friend with Ruth Paine. Ruth Paine's family also has connections to Dulles. She brings in Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife and child into her house when he comes back in the United States. She actually is the one who gets Oswald a job at the Texas School Book Depository in the weeks leading up to Kennedy's assassination. So these CIA figures are operating around Oswald and sort of maneuver him into place to be the perfect patsy uh, for this operation to kill Kennedy. Now, when Kennedy's assassinated in November of 63, Alan Dulles spends the day of the assassination and the ensuing weekend at the CIA's alternative headquarters, nicknamed the Farm. Now, the Farm isn't some place for CIA alumni to go hang out and tell old war stories. It is literally a secure facility with a full comms array meant to direct operations. And for some reason, the fired from the CIA, Alan Dulles, is there for the assassination and throughout the cover up, the killing of Oswald, and the fraudulent autopsy that would ensue. So, who killed JFK? We don't really know, but we know that the Warren Commission was an absolute force. The Warren Commission was the um, group that was responsible for investigating the murder and coming up with, a theory of who done it and why. And we know it was a farce in part because Alan Dulles was basically the one running it. LBJ allowed Dulles to be on the Warren Commission, even though he hated Kennedy and Kennedy fired and hated him. I mean, Dulles was really one of the number one suspects for the murder, or at least participating in it. Yet he is there coaching witnesses, intimidating some witnesses, never missing a meeting, and championing this lone gunman theory, and also suggesting that Lee Harvey Oswald is a Soviet asset. So totally corrupt from the get-go. Um, the evidence, or the official story defies physical reality. The official story is that he was shot from behind by one person. The doctors at the Parkland Hospital said, no, no, no. He was shot in the throat and from the front to the side, um, basically suggesting that there were multiple shooters that triangulated on Kennedy to ensure they killed him, not just one person from behind. Um, you should go watch the documentary that's available. I forget what it's called, but a couple Google searches and you should be able to find it. There's a documentary from the last 5 or so years where these Parkland Hospital doctors are now in their 80s and 90s and have come out and say, hey, we were threatened, we were intimidated, we were made to fudge the autopsy, um, or we would have been killed. And here's the reality of what we saw. He was definitely shot from multiple positions coming from the front and side. So, JFK is assassinated, and there's really one person who could have led the charge to help us figure out who done it, and that was his brother, Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy didn't come out and revolt against the Warren Commission. He kind of laid low. I mean, he was absolutely paralyzed with grief, and understandably so. Um, but he kind of had a plan to run for president, and he would use the president's office to figure out who did it. The only problem was the powers that orchestrated the assassination and coup of Kennedy weren't going to let that happen. And he was assassinated himself while on the campaign trail and the leading candidate for the presidency in Los Angeles. And he was killed by a guy named Sirhan Sirhan, allegedly. I don't think most people believe that. There's actually a great book by a woman named Lisa Pease that goes into the entire Kennedy or Robert Kennedy assassination, and just like JFK suggests that the official story is a lie. Sirhan was a patsy. He was actually likely a like an MK Ultra victim who was put in the right place at the right time. Um, RFK was shot, with a contact wound to the back of his head. Sirhan was standing several feet in front of RFK when he was killed. I mean, the whole story is full of holes. Go read about it. Go read Lisa's book. But the short of it is that he was murdered to help clean up the cover up so that we would never find out who, in fact, paid for the bullet or pulled the trigger as it relates to JFK. Now, that's really the end of the story. James Jesus Angleton was also interviewed on his deathbed, and he more or less came clean to the fact that, he and his colleagues were a bunch of scoundrels. They were driven by the desire for absolute power. He's also quoted as suggesting that he thinks he's going to hell and that he's going to see a lot of his intelligence counterparts there or colleagues there. Um, there's a lot to be learned about James Jesus Angleton, and there's a lot of good research available about him in particular, especially his ties to Israel and how he likely helped them um, secure what they needed to develop a nuclear bomb. And yeah, I guess I'll leave you with I guess my final thought is to go read the book first and foremost. David Talbot did an excellent job um, detailing the story. There's a lot that I left out of this overview. Um, until we actually learn who killed Kennedy, I would suspect that um, those same folks or their descendants or representatives are still in power. So go educate yourself, learn about the secret government, and let me know what you think about the book once you're done reading it. All right, thanks everybody. Take care.